How does one acquire faith? Well, that sounds like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? But I actually find it a difficult question to answer because, in a way, it's a question that I feel like I've never really had to struggle with for myself. You see, my journey to faith has been pretty simple and pretty straightforward. You know, when I think about it, I guess I would describe it and have described it in this way. I think that I was loved into the faith. By my family, of course, but also by the small, close-knit, rural church that I was baptized into when I was just a few months old and was part of until at the ripe old age of 24, Mother Church in her wisdom decided to ordain me and sent me off to northern Alberta as a newly minted United Church minister. Still pretty wet behind the ears with a lot to learn, but also filled with energy and optimism and hope. And there are a lot of things about my early religious experience and upbringing in that relatively conservative rural United Church that I have long since quite intentionally and very gladly left behind. There are many other things about my early Christian experience that I value and cherish to this day. The importance of community, the art of simplicity, and the profound gift of a strong faith in a loving God. Now, I know that it all sounds very quaint and old-fashioned now, but I'm sure I'm not the only one here who remembers how we used to have to memorize Bible verses in Sunday school when we were children. And I was not then, and I'm still not, very good at memorizing. So a lot of what I did manage to memorize in those days has long since vanished in the mists of time. But I do still remember several significant verses of Scripture, and I'm wondering if these will sound familiar to you as well. John 3:16, probably the most memorized verse in the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And it's always interesting to me how when I quote scripture like that, I flip right back into the King James Version of the Bible. And then there was what's the shortest verse in the Bible, and I bet some of you know this. Jesus wept. And also what was probably the first Bible verse that I ever memorized, and it was easy because it's just 3 words, and it's from our scripture reading this morning from 1 John, that very simple statement, God is love. You know, I think that I heard those words and repeated those words so many times as a child that I totally internalized those words completely. And I say that because while there is almost no religious belief or doctrine that I have not since questioned or struggled to reframe or to reinterpret or even to discard, that one belief that God is love has remained constant throughout my entire life. So some of us, like me, are fortunate enough to have received faith as a gift, really, an accident of birth, almost, or an intentional act of nurture, but still a gift. But faith can also be seen as a choice, where ultimate questions, the big questions of life and faith, are examined and addressed. Is there a God? Does human life, does my life have any real meaning and purpose apart from simply surviving from one day to the next? Is human life basically good or basically evil? Some of us, like me, grew up in an environment where these choices were made quite early in our lives and largely not even consciously. In our experience, it feels as though we have always had faith. But other people I know have quite different experiences, much more dramatic experiences of the divine. Sometimes we call them conversions or rebirths or transformations. And those can be either sudden or gradual, but usually quite overwhelming experiences of the presence of the holy that have convinced them of the existence of God. Well, I believe that however we come to faith, the choices we make about these ultimate questions about life and faith will shape all of the choices we make in our lives. It's my conviction that what we choose to believe affects the way we act in the world, the way we live our lives, the way we view the world. And it's why I like and chose, thanks to Jonathan, the hymn that we just sang, Creating God, We Give You Thanks. And I chose it mainly for the last verse, which is really the text for my message this morning. Since what we choose is what we are, and what we love, we yet shall be. So, for example, if we believe that we human beings are born in sin, and this doctrine is called original sin, and interestingly, it's never really been a part of Protestant theology, but has somehow seeped into our religious culture. If that's our starting point, if that's our worldview, that we're born in sin, then how does that affect the way we live our lives and the choices we make and how we relate to other people? Well, if we believe that we are born in sin, then human beings are basically evil, aren't we? Not to be trusted. Our bodies are bad. Sexuality is dirty. We are fallen, sinful creatures, and what we need more than anything else is conversion and redemption. What we need more than anything else is to be saved. But on the other hand, if we believe that we are created in the image of God and are pronounced good by God, and this is called creation spirituality or original blessing, if that's our starting place, if that's our worldview, then how does that affect the way we live our lives? Well, in this case, human life is seen as a precious gift. It contains the spark of the divine. God exists in each one of us. Our bodies are good. Sexuality is a gift. And all people are unconditionally loved by God and deserve to be loved unconditionally by others. In this way of thinking, we are precious, treasured, cherished, loved children of God. And so you can see that that's quite a different mindset. I remember a story that poses somewhat the same question in a slightly different way. And it's a story about a minister who was a member of a presbytery education and students committee back in the days when we had presbytery. Today it would be a region education and students committee. And this committee had the responsibility of interviewing potential candidates who were presenting themselves to be considered for ministry in the United Church. And this man would instruct each one of the candidates when he met them. He would say, I want you to look out the window. Look at that busy street out there with hundreds of people coming and going all the time, going about their business. And I want you to tell me, I want you to describe to me what you see there. And it was his experience that students' responses were, generally speaking, and also significantly, divided into two categories. There were those who would answer something like, I see lost, sinful souls, people who need to be saved, and that's why I want to be a minister. And then there were others who would say something like, I see children of God who need to be loved, and that's why I want to be a minister. Well, I don't know about you, but I know which of those two I would choose to be my minister. And so at its core, it comes down to what amounts to a fairly simple question, a choice. What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of church do I want to help to create and belong to? What kind of community do I want to live in? And what kind of world do I want to leave behind for my children and my grandchildren? And we can make that choice. We do have the power and the freedom to do that. Do we want to be narrow and judgmental and mean-spirited and angry all the time? I know people like that, and I'm sure you do too. Or do we want to be generous and gracious and open and tender-hearted? In other words, is ours a theology based on fear or a theology based on love? Well, in my own life, I know that if I choose to believe, and I think it's a choice, that the universe is basically hostile and evil, then I can see human suffering around me. I can see poverty and hunger and sickness and discrimination and racism and sexism and transphobia and homophobia, and I can walk by and shrug it off by saying, well, you know, that's just the way life is, isn't it? The world is an evil, sinful place, full of evil, sinful people. So what do you expect? But on the other hand, if I make a different choice, if I choose to believe that the universe is basically good and that we are lovingly created in God's image, then when I encounter evil in the world, all those same things, the poverty and the sexism and the homophobia, I'm compelled to notice there is something wrong with this picture. This is not God's intention for the world that God created and nurtured in love, and it has to stop. And then I need to ask myself the hard question, what can I do to change this? And just as our individual and personal choices determine who we are and how we live our lives, so do the choices we make as an institution, as a faith community, as a church like Metropolitan, determine who we are and how we live our collective lives as a community. And this is an important thing to consider because spirituality, certainly in the Christian tradition, is about community. It's about relationships. It's about connection. It's about our relationship with what we call the holy or the divine or the sacred or God, however you experience that and name that for yourself. And it's also about our relationship with one another and with all of creation. God calls the church away from what is safe and predictable and secure toward a radical inclusiveness, a radical hospitality that is much more consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, the one who associated with the outcasts and the sinners, who hung out with the prostitutes and the beggars and the tax collectors, and consistently condemned the pious and the self-righteous. As a denomination, the United Church of Canada has made some of those difficult and significant choices as to the kind of church we want to be. And in some cases, as you all well know, we've paid a high price, a heavy price for that, with congregations splitting and people leaving the church in anger. And it all began exactly 100 years ago at the time of church union, which was in itself very controversial, and split congregations and split communities and even split families, as was the 1936 decision to ordain women in the United Church, the 1988 decision around the ordination of LGBTQ plus people, our support in 2003 for equal marriage in Canada when almost every other church in the country was opposing it. Positive and supportive statements in 2009 and 11 about the inclusion of transgender folk in all aspects of our church's life. Now that's as a national church, but as a congregation, we here at Metropolitan have also made some of those choices, asking the question, what kind of church do we want to be? And the answer, we want to be an inclusive faith community, an affirming ministry, a place where all are welcome regardless of gender, orientation, ability, background, and belief. A church that strives to offer hope, healing, and beauty through sacred space, inclusive community, compassionate action, and excellence in worship and music, in the profound traditions of the Christian faith, to boldly lead in nurturing faith for the transformation of lives and the betterment of God's world. That's the articulated mission of Metropolitan United Church. But of course, as so many things, it all starts with individuals. It all starts with people like you and me. It all starts with the choices we make about the kind of people we want to be, the kind of church we want, the kind of world we want to create. I'm convinced that what we choose to believe does, in fact and in practice, in the words of the hymn that we just sang, that what we choose is what we are, and what we love we yet shall be. It makes a difference in how we act in the world and how we live our lives, both as individuals and as a church. Turning to Scripture, I believe that in the words of the creation myth in Genesis, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and that God declares that we are good. I believe in the words of the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, I have called you by your name, you are mine. I believe in the words of the psalmist that God formed our inward parts and fashioned us in our mother's womb, and that we are fearfully, wonderfully made. I believe in Jesus' words from our reading from Mark this morning that we are called to love God and to love one another. And I believe in the words of the first letter of John, that God is love, and that in love there is no fear. I'll finish this morning by talking about an article that I saw in a 1991 issue of Christian Century, and I've saved it all this time, so clearly it was meaningful to me. And it was an article written by a man by the name of William Carroll. And the article was called God as Unloving Father, in which he described his experience of coming out as a gay man after 21 years of ministry and 23 years of marriage. He describes his sense of isolation and anger, but also his excitement and his hope. And I have to say that I didn't write this, but I could have, because it's my story as well. And he ends his article with these words. And now, he says, I am rebuilding a damaged faith in God. I have discovered that conversion does not mean rejecting myself, but means accepting myself as God created me. The greatest sin in my life, the point of my greatest alienation from God, was trying to be something that I was not and could not be. I believe that God's grace has allowed me to look in the mirror and to love myself for the first time in my life. I'm starting off on a new journey, and like Abraham and Sarah, I don't know exactly where I'm going. But this time, it's not because God has abandoned me, but because God is beckoning me. God has called me out of the closet not only to rediscover my faith, but also to discover myself as a gay person. I've been drawn to some familiar words of Jesus, and I plan to hang on to them. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And finally, I have reclaimed a beautiful thought from my childhood, something from my Sunday school days, a biblical image, a simple statement with the ring of truth. God is love.